published. So this is an opportunity for you to see some unpublished images from the National Geographic story I did a ways back about Jerusalem. So first, to answer that question of, well, who am I, and yet another person who's talking about Jerusalem? Well, I've been writing about archaeology in the Middle East and Central Asia for about 20 years. And let me assure you that I come to the topic of Jerusalem kicking and screaming. This was not a topic I thought I would engage with. Why? Well, because I'm primarily a science writer, and Jerusalem seemed, oh, it was so full of religion and politics, and oh my God, I didn't really want to get into what seemed like a mess to me. I was interested in more in the science of archaeology. But then, a few years ago, I was at a conference in Haifa, an archaeology conference, and I got in contact with Israel Finkelstein, who's a well-known Israeli archaeologist who I've known for years. And he said, oh, great, well, let's meet Jerusalem and we'll go for lunch and maybe take a walk. I said, oh, well, that sounds great. He has a French wife. He likes nice French food. And I thought, well, this will be a good meal. Well, I never got the meal. He took me underground and introduced me to a whole barrage of Israeli archaeologists who were working beneath the city. And I was stunned to see what was going on. I thought I knew. I kind of kept track of digs in Jerusalem, but the extent of what was going on really stunned me. And then when I began to read up a little bit more, I realized that there was a bigger story, and that is the story of all the people who've been digging in Jerusalem for the past 150 years. And in fact, even though Jerusalem has changed more fundamentally than almost any city on earth in the past 150 years, some things have remained the same. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight, the thread that I found when I started to piece together what's going on beneath the city. But first, in order to do that, let me see if I can, having a little trouble advancing my screen, which of course, there we go. Got it. So many of you have been to Jerusalem, I'm sure. Many of you have probably been there more than I have. But for those of you who have not, just to get a sense of the geography, this is a satellite image. We're coming down. You see the Nile River there, that long green snake. You see Mesopotamia to the right. Now we're coming down on the Dead Sea, and then the rugged Judean highlands, which is where Jerusalem is. And boom, right down onto what Jews call the Temple Mount. For Muslims, this is the Haram al-Sharif, this rectangular area, which is so central to Jerusalem's history and to its present and to its future, no doubt. So this is, there's the Dome of the Rock that's sitting right there in the center of the platform. So this is the landscape that we're dealing with. But of course, the question is, well, why Jerusalem? And what is so odd about this place is that you saw it's in a very rugged area. It's not on a major trading path. There's no port. There's no river even. There's one little spring. I mean, this is not a place that you would have looked at and said, this is going to be one of the world's most important cities. Now, of course, the reason why it is so well known is primarily because of religion. For thousands of years, it has drawn pilgrims from all over. The bottom left, of course, is the Western Wall, which is part of that Acropolis complex I just showed you. To the right, you see the Dome of the Rock. For Muslims, it's the third site in Islam. This is the place where, actually, I think it's going to be in about next month, Muslims will celebrate the mystical journey that Muhammad took from the rock that's underneath the Dome of the Rock into heaven, where he met the Jewish prophets. And then you have at the top there is the Holy Sepulchre, which is the traditional place where Jesus was both crucified and buried. There you see it on Easter in all of its Greek Orthodox glory. Our photographer took this with great care from the very top of the dome. So aside from these three famous places that no doubt you've all heard of, there are hundreds of shrines, some of which are shared by the three faiths, some of which are unique to the three faiths. You also have tombs, and virtually every place in the old city is considered sacred by somebody. Now, to put it in context, if you haven't been there, this may be a surprise, but if you look to the right, you see here's an image, an aerial image of the old city. Here's the wall around the old city that defines it. And you could basically take the old city and drop it into the reservoir in Central Park. I mean, we're talking about a very, very small area in which all of these shrines and sacred spaces are cramped. So I like to talk about, kind of get the basics of geography and geology down so you have a context for this place. And one thing that's important is that Jerusalem was part of an ancient seabed. So it's built on limestone. And this is a kind of magical stone because it's stone that when you quarry it, it's very soft. But when you bring it above ground and you place it in the elements, it weathers and becomes harder. So it's this unique stone that also has that beautiful golden color that many of you have probably seen if you've been there at sunset. So as a result, you have quarries like the one below, known as Zedekiah's cave, Zedekiah's quarry, Solomon's quarry, has many names, that runs underneath the Muslim quarter of the old city. And basically, this is an enormous cavern that stretches very, very far underground that was used to quarry the stone that the city was built with. And because the city doesn't have a lot of timber, the use of stone arches was common. So Jerusalem is unusual, not just because of its religious significance, but also because people built arches. They didn't have timber to build the roofs with. So instead, they built stone arches, and then a stone arch on top of a stone arch on top of a stone arch. And these spaces have been reused. Maybe they started off as a palace, and then later they became a trash dump, and then later was used for as a cistern. So as a result, you have to think of underground Jerusalem as this series of vaults and caves and porous areas where you have water flowing that makes it a very complicated underground. And there on the far left, you'll see the spring, the Gihon spring, which is the spring I mentioned, that is the sole source of water for ancient Jerusalem. Now, just to give you an idea of how pervasive this underground is, I stayed in the Christian quarter quite a bit when I was in Jerusalem over the course of about 3 years. And finally, the place where I went to get my groceries, he was a Muslim, and he said, "Who are you? You know, you're not a tourist. You've been here too long." And I explained what I was doing, and he laughed. He walked over to the potato chip aisle, lifted the hatch, and disappeared. So what did I do? Well, of course, I put my groceries down and I followed. And beneath this shop was this tremendous, huge Crusader era hall that had recently been dug out by Coptic monks who lived next door in the Holy Sepulchre. And this turned out to be a whole chapter in my book. I won't give it away what happened, but let's just say it was a 20-year battle, both violent and legal, that involved Jewish lawyers, Muslim shopkeepers, Coptic monks, Arafat, Netanyahu, you name it. Everybody was involved in trying to determine who owned this fantastic space. And this was just my local grocery store. So I'm going to be very brief on this. It is important to know a little bit about Jerusalem's history and think of it as, I try to think of it in 3 big pieces. The first is not very well known by many people, and that is the first 2,000 years of Jerusalem's history before the Israelites arrived. So at that time, this was a place that was peopled by Bronze Age folk who built this town into a small settlement around the time that the big cities are first arriving, first appearing in Egypt and Babylonia or Mesopotamia. So when these large cities are first getting constructed, Jerusalem is a small town, and it continues to be a town, not a major city, but you have Egyptians moving through, Canaanites, and then finally, sometime after the year 1000 BC, you have the arrival of the Israelites. Now, this is what I think of as the biblical millennium. This is what most of us are familiar with from the Bible. This is the period between the time of the arrival of King David and the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in 70 CE, so around 1100 years. And you have not just Judeans there, of course. You have Assyrians, Babylonians, Greeks, Romans, Phoenicians, you name it. I mean, remember, we're in the Middle East. There are people moving around all the time. And so there's this enormous cultural mixing that's going on in this period, sometimes for the benefit of Jerusalem and sometimes not. And then the third part of Jerusalem's history is this period, the past 2,000 years. And in that time, the Romans rebuilt the city. basically is a Roman city. So the city you see today, the streets you walk on, are really built on a Roman plan that antedates the time of King Herod in the 1st century BC. So the Romans rebuilt the city, and then you had Persian invasions. You have these Christianized Romans called Byzantines who turned it into a very large city in early medieval times. And then you have the arrival of course, of Islam from Arabia in the 7th century CE, followed by the Crusaders who come in, the Christians who want to take Jerusalem back from the Muslims. And then in the end, the Ottomans arrive around the time of Martin Luther in Europe, around 1517. They arrive, they conquer Jerusalem. These are Turkic-speaking Muslim people, set up their capital in Istanbul, control Jerusalem for the next 500 years. So there you go, Jerusalem's history in one slide. I'm proud that I can do that. So now to the main event. So what I was interested in is who dug in Jerusalem and why? Why did people go there to dig? And I discovered it all began in the 1860s with this amazing cast of characters who I really, if I were a fiction writer, I could not begin to do justice to the kind of crazy and interesting people who arrived in Jerusalem in the 19th century. One of the first was a French senator, a friend of the Emperor Napoleon III of France. He managed to get permission from the Sultan, the Islamic Sultan in Istanbul, to dig at what's called the Tomb of the Kings. This is a place you can visit today. It's Jerusalem's most magnificent tomb. In fact, I just did a story in Biblical Archaeology Review in the last issue about this, if you're interested. So he went and dug through this tomb, found a sarcophagus, opened it up, and found the remains of what clearly was a royal woman. Now, he kind of got it wrong. He said that it was the wife of an ancient Judean king. So it was a Judean queen from the line of David. This turned out to be malarkey. It was a case of finding what you want to find. In fact, this woman probably was buried sometime in the 1st or 2nd century CE. So it was off by 1,000 years, but nobody knew that at the time. It went to the Louvre. It was a sensation. People from all over Europe were excited for the first time to be able to see remnants from the biblical past. This is a very big deal. At a time when Christianity and Judaism were under fire from those saying, well, we've got Darwin, we've got geology that are showing that Genesis isn't correct. So this was a real sensation to be for people to come to the Louvre, say we've used scientific methods to find remains from the Bible. But the Jewish community was outraged. They were outraged because to them, this Catholic French guy coming along and digging out an ancient Jewish grave was not okay. It was desecration. So from the beginning, this first dig, you have politics, you have religion, and you have science all mixed up together. And that's the way it remained and remains today. Now, the British, who of course were the great rivals to the French in the 19th century, they were not about to let the French get all this good biblical stuff and put it in the Louvre. So they ginned up their own effort, the Palestine Exploration Fund, to be sure that Britain was at the front ranks of biblical archaeology, this new idea, this idea that you could use science to essentially to prove the Bible. Some of the early explorers really believed that. So this started in the 1860s, mid-1860s, and a whole cast of characters from England arrived. They were mapping underground. This man named Charles Warren, here's a lovely caricature of him there. He is the one who did a lot of the mapping and exploring beneath the city. Now here's a video that was taken just a month or two ago in Jerusalem in the Western Wall Tunnel. And at the time of Warren doing this, exploring this, it was filled with sewage. And look how big this thing, I mean, look how high this thing goes. That's the street above. So you really get an idea of the scale of these underground spaces. And in order to access these spaces, Warren did things like use gunpowder to blast his way through in order to be able to map these areas, which didn't sit well with the Muslims who were living upstairs in the Muslim quarter. So a lot of the Arab Muslims, they were furious because they thought, oh my God, this British guy is trying to destroy the noble sanctuary, the Temple Mount, and the third holiest shrine in Islam. So this was a very big deal, and this created bad blood between the Arabs and the British, as well as the Ottomans, because remember, the Ottomans are the people in charge of allowing the Westerners to dig. So you have both Jews as well as Arabs who are not happy with these Westerners showing up looking for biblical treasure. And speaking of treasure, so in the 1890s, you have this group of archaeologists who arrive, and their goal is to find the city of David. So what's that? Well, remember, around 1000 BC, according to the biblical text, King David arrives with the Israelites. Well, the question is, where was that place? Where was that city? There had been no evidence of a city dating to that period. The old city, what we call the old city today, those walls were actually built in 1500. And most of that city goes back a ways, but certainly not to 1000 BC. So Bliss and Dickey, these two gentlemen here, don't ask me which is which, they look the same to me. They began to dig in Mount Zion here, see the bottom left map, didn't find anything there. So they went and explored this area here, which at that point was just pasture land. And it was this little thin peninsula of land that stuck out from the Temple Mount. And they began to dig there, and sure enough, they found some pottery which seemed to show that this was the oldest place known in Jerusalem. Now, people got excited because, of course, where was David buried? Where was Solomon buried? The bottom right there, there's an image of what many people view, how people in the 19th century viewed Solomon's tomb. They thought it was a massive structure because he was the byword for wealth, right? And of course, the Ark of the Covenant shown there in the center, which had vanished sometime before or during the invasion and destruction by the Babylonians in 586 BC. I'm sure you've all heard of that. So the question is, where's all the cool stuff that the Bible talks about in the city of David? And this drew a really bizarre array of archaeology. Well, I can't say archaeology. I'll say treasure hunters. So in 1909, this British aristocrat named Montague Parker, he teams up with this kind of crazy Finnish theologian who's got an idea that he has cracked the code in Ezekiel that explains exactly where the treasure of the temple treasures are, the lost temple treasures, including the ark, where these things are. So he gets hundreds of thousands of dollars in today's money from Americans and Europeans who are eager to invest in this project, because it's estimated that these treasures, if they were on the art market, today would be worth maybe close to $6 billion. So we're talking about not just sacred objects that people want to find, but things that can make a lot of money. So they dug for 2 years, found absolutely nothing except some pottery, and then desperate to find something so he could pay back his investors, Parker does something really crazy. He bribes the guards on the noble sanctuary, Temple Mount, and manages to go into the Dome of the Rock at night and begins to whack away at the sacred rock that is sacred to both Jews and Muslims. Well, of course, this didn't go well. He was discovered. The team had to flee from town. There were riots in the streets. Muslims were furious that these heretics, these Western Christians, had shown up and had desecrated one of their holiest sites. There's an image looking down at the rock that I mentioned. And the rumor got out that, in fact, they had found Solomon's treasures, and that's why they had run away. So this became an international scandal, not just riots in Jerusalem, but the government in Istanbul almost fell because of outrage among Arab Muslims in particular over what had happened, over this desecration. And, of course, what they actually found, you can see the picture there, they found some old pottery, which was of great interest to archaeologists, but not to treasure hunters. In fact, they forgot to hire an archaeologist for this 2-year mission. Gives you an idea of the kind of professionalism sometimes that happens in Jerusalem. So this also sparked something important, and that is it got the attention of European Jews. European Jews suddenly realized that you have these Christians who are busy uh, trying to find Jewish treasures. So Edmund de Rothschild decided that he was going to be sure that it was Jews rather than Christians that got the Ark of the Covenant, and he launched an expedition that was, however, cut short by World War I. Now, I'm going to go through this really fast, so stay with me. The first half of the 20th century was very bloody. The British finally conquered Jerusalem. Arabs and Jews are at each other's throats for the next few decades. Finally, Britain withdraws. Israel is created. There's a war. Jerusalem is divided down the middle. The old city landing in East Jerusalem under Jordanian or Arab control. And that's the way things stood until 1967, when, of course, the Six-Day War, Israel conquers all of Jerusalem, including East Jerusalem and the Old City, and they begin to dig. And this is where things get really exciting, because these archaeologists, in particular Benjamin Mazar on the left, he digs just to the west of the Temple Mount. And there he finds really exciting evidence of this grand city that Herod the Great renovated. I mean, this city was turned into this classical showpiece that drew tourists as well as pilgrims from around the Roman Empire. So he was able to show that a lot of the legends and stories about Jerusalem being quite magnificent in that period were true. At the same time, you remember, archaeology sometimes doesn't play by the rules that the politicians wanted to play by. This gentleman in blue, Meir Ben Dov, who I spent a good deal of time with, he's still alive. Well, he's quite elderly now, but he has great stories. And he was digging south of the Temple Mount. So if you see here, the noble sanctuary or Temple Mount, this rectangle, there's the Dome of the Rock. And here's Al-Aqsa Mosque, built in the 7th and 8th centuries CE. Now, Ben Dov, when he was digging, discovered these foundations of these fantastic, huge palaces, and no one knew it existed. Turns out they were early Islamic palaces, which showed that Jerusalem had been important politically as well as religiously for early Muslims, which is something that historians had not assumed. This was also a little embarrassing for the Israeli government, which was busy trying to convince the world that East Jerusalem was part of Israel. In fact, it was annexed as part of Israel. So Ben Dov actually was told by a colleague to bulldoze the evidence. It was so politically hot. And he decided, as a good scientist, not to, and brought it to the attention of the world, which gives us a really fresh picture of Jerusalem in that period. Now, meanwhile, while this is going on, and many of you who've been to Jerusalem will be familiar with the Western Wall tunnels, but you may not know that it began as a secret effort by rabbis in the late 1960s. It was kept secret for a number of years. The idea was to dig a tunnel that went all the way the length of the Western Wall. So to the right there, you see the Western Wall Plaza right here. And the idea was to dig a tunnel all the way to the very end of the Western Wall. So not just the Western Wall Plaza, where you have a small amount of the wall that's visible, but to go underground and follow it. Now, the idea was to create this prayer space where Jews could pray. Seemed like a good idea at the time. People had no idea of the political implications of what would come about as a result. And here's some of the foundation stones that are just mammoth that lay at the base of that Western Wall, built probably in the 1st century BC, 1st century CE, when it was renovated at the order of Herod. So when Rabbi Getz, the upper left, began this project, he was hoping not just to create this tunnel, which is underneath largely the Muslim quarter and some of the oldest Muslim buildings in the city. He was also hoping to find the Ark. So in 1981, he penetrates through the wall underneath the noble sanctuary, underneath the Temple Mount, moving toward the Dome of the Rock, where he was sure, as Parker had been before him, that the Ark of the Covenant and the temple treasures were hidden. Now, seemed like a good idea at the time. Of course, it turned out to be not a good idea, because not only did they not find the Ark, but it caused a tremendous hullabaloo. In fact, it almost sparked a war between Arabs in the Middle East and Israelis. It was a very tense time. And what's interesting is that although officially the Israeli government denied any knowledge, they said it's a rogue rabbi, we had nothing to do with it. Actually, I discovered in my research, and I have some more detail in the chapter about this, that in fact, senior Israeli government officials were intimately aware what was going on, and they also had bought into this idea that they could find the Ark. So here you see this legend of the Ark is driving not just explorers looking for money, but it's also driving people with political and religious agendas. And in 1996, when the tunnel had been finished, at the very end, they decided, once it was completed after a few years of waiting because they knew it could cause troubles, the Israeli government opened an exit at the end of the tunnel, right in the heart of the Muslim quarter. This caused huge protests. More than 100 people died, thousands of people were injured, and really it was the beginning of the end of the Oslo Peace Accords that were trying to create an independent Palestine, as well as Israel that could live in peace. But it all foundered over the issue of Jerusalem, and the riots that happened in 1996 really left a bad taste in everyone's mouth. Now, moving ahead quickly in the 1990s and 2000s, remember that search for the city of David. Well, the city of David, certainly there was pottery found that seemed to come from that era, but the odd thing was that in the 1990s, when Israeli archaeologists returned to dig in this area, they found incredible Bronze Age structures, that is from before 1000 BC, before the time of the Israelites. But there was absolutely no sign of the Jerusalem of David and Solomon. Not a single building. There was some pottery and this and that. And then a few centuries later, yes, you have clear evidence of Judean Jerusalem. But there was this huge gap in what was becoming for the Israeli government rather embarrassing, because if you want to claim Jerusalem as your own, but you can't find the physical evidence to it, it makes people a little anxious. So in 2005, an archaeologist named Eilat Mazar, who unfortunately passed away this past May, she dug there at the city of David, and she found, and you can see in blue here, this interesting, mysterious building. And she dated it to exactly the time of David. She said, this is the Palace of David. Now, her colleagues remain unconvinced. While this was news around the world and many people accepted it at face value, her colleagues are not convinced that her dating is correct. They believe that it could be an earlier building or a later building. You ask any archaeologist, they'll have a different story. So I think at this point, the big question in Jerusalem is, archaeologically, is where is that city of David? Can this really be nailed down? And I want to mention what is clearly the most ambitious, the most expensive, and the most controversial archaeological dig on Earth. And you may not have heard of it. So in 2013, an effort began to find something that people had an idea existed. So the idea was that around the time of Herod, that a massive monumental street, a step street, had been built from the Pool of Siloam at the bottom of that little piece of land sticking out from the Temple Mount. The stairway had been built so you could do your ritual ablutions there in the pool. You could move up, walk up to the Temple Mount and enter the Temple Mount. So it was a pilgrimage route as well as a main street of Jerusalem. So there had been some evidence of this in individual digs that had happened, but the idea came up, why don't we expose this entire street? Well, it wasn't practical because you have a huge neighborhood now. It's grown up into quite a large suburban area right above this street. So what to do? And on top of that, they're mostly Arabs that live in this neighborhood. So the city of David, also known as Elad, it's a foundation which is involved above ground in moving Jewish settlers into this Arab part of town. They came up with the funds to actually bore a subway-sized tunnel beneath the city of David, beneath this neighborhood, to expose this street. But what they found, again, politicians don't always get what they want, was something surprising. And that is that this street apparently was not built by Herod. It was not a vision, might have been a vision of Herod, but the person who made it happen was one of our greatest villains for both Christians, because he is blamed for crucifying Jesus, as well as for Jews who believed that he was incredibly disrespectful to Judaism and began the path that led to the war with Rome. That was Pontius Pilate. So Pontius Pilate, we know it was likely him because the coins found underneath these stones date the street precisely to the 30s AD, the 30s CE. So we know that Pilate was a driving force behind building a monumental street that likely imitated the Via Sacra in Rome. To me, this is just utterly fascinating that you have a Roman who is considered a villain, yet he's doing something to glorify Jerusalem and to glorify Judaism. So I think it gives us a much more interesting, complex, nuanced picture of Jerusalem's past. And this I'm not going to go into. This is a fascinating dig that is being done across the street from City of David at the Gavati parking lot, just south of the Temple Mount. It's producing all kinds of interesting materials that are surprising, like images, like Athena, Egyptian gods. It's showing that Jerusalem was not just an isolated outpost of monotheism. It actually was part of that larger Middle Eastern fabric that included people who didn't believe in the taboo on images, for example. So it gives us a much richer view of the city. And finally, and then I want to really get to questions in just a moment, I think what I learned was that from the beginning, from that first French dig, the digs that were happening below Jerusalem are part of the conflict happening above. In fact, it's the archaeologists, in a sense, who have made Jerusalem such a contested place. So some of the issues today, which really are similar to 150 years ago, one of them is, are these excavations that are taking place in East Jerusalem legal? Why does that matter? Well, under international law, you're not supposed to dig in occupied territory without the approval of the locals. Well, the local Palestinians certainly don't want Israelis digging in East Jerusalem, but nevertheless, that digging goes on. Now, Israel, of course, maintains that this is an annex. They've annexed this part of the city, and it is part of Israel, therefore it's legal. So this is just a continuing debate that goes on. And meanwhile, as you had in the 19th century, Arabs are complaining that these tunnels and this archaeological work is damaging the foundations of their homes. I wouldn't necessarily want people digging below my house, and certainly it creates a whole level of tension when you have Arabs above and Jewish archaeologists below who are digging. And this has made this area a political hotspot that occasionally breaks into violence. And finally, you've got patrons with strong political and religious agendas. I mean, le plus ça change, as the French say. What does that mean? Well, you had Queen Victoria and the French emperor in the 19th century. Today, you have largely Jewish organizations, Israeli organizations, such as Elad, that's David Berry at the far right, who's the head of Elad, who are very involved in the politics of Jerusalem today. These aren't people who are simply wanting to get scientific data. These are people who really want to gain certain kinds of knowledge in order to push a certain agenda. And then finally, how do you decide who's right? And this, in the scientific community, is a normal enough thing. You argue over whether your data shows A or whether it shows B. But in Jerusalem, it's also charged. I mean, a 1,400-year-old palace, whether it was built by Muslims or whether it was built by Byzantines, would not be a burning issue, except in Jerusalem. So it gives you a sense that the science, religion, and politics that make up this city and have from the 1860s really creates a very fascinating and unique mix. So finally, the bottom right, there's a toilet that was found, 2,700-year-old toilet. It's in the news just a few weeks ago. Why did it make the news? Because it's in Jerusalem. A toilet in any other place would likely not make the headlines. So some of the challenges that I think I discovered and surprises were that it was really Western Christians, not Jews or Muslims, who kicked off the fascination, the modern fascination with Jerusalem. And then this biblical millennium continues to draw the most media attention, and therefore it attracts funding, and it also attracts controversy, because many people say, well, yeah, the biblical millennium is important, but you have two millenniums on the left and 2 millenniums on the right that don't get the same kind of focus. Obviously, there's a political religious aspect to that. And finally, and you can call me naive, that's fine. But I do have this suspicion that while we have these Jewish and Christian and Muslim stories about Jerusalem, and they're all very fixed and very clear narratives that people believe in. This is belief. It's not science. It's what people believe. It's fundamental to their natures. But I do think that the science that's coming out of Jerusalem, like about Pontius Pilate, for example, is offering us a more nuanced and richer, and I think a more beautiful view of what Jerusalem is and how different peoples at different times have contributed to make this such a unique place. And if science can offer an alternative vision, then possibly someday, maybe Jerusalem could actually be that city of peace that we all hope it might be. So with that, I want to thank you and thank Geographic for all their support, and the Israeli Antiquities Authority was great in allowing me access to all these places. They were really wonderful, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
So Andrew, thank you so much. Absolutely fascinating. And when you said you were going to finish up, I had to check the time because I couldn't believe it had passed so quickly. So anyway, let me just say, if people have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. That's the best way to do it. Then Andrew can see them and I can see them, or I can see them and ask them.
Yeah, why don't you just ask them? That would be great.
So feel free to write questions in the chat and I will present them to Andrew and he can share them with us, share his insights and his answers.
And if you want to kick off with a question while people are typing, that would be great.
Okay, very good. Hang on just a second. I'm just curious, a less sophisticated question, but how long did you spend in Jerusalem as part of your research here?
I came and went. Well, I've gone there several times over the course of my career just to visit and do an occasional story. But for this, I spent about 3 years just going back and forth. I found living in the old city was very intense. And after about 3 weeks, I had to come home. There's just such an energetic intensity about it. It's not that it's dangerous or violent or anything like that. I never had any problems. It's more just a feeling that I needed to get out. Living in a walled city is something I hadn't done before. And you're both protected and you feel a little closed in. So yeah. I had to kind of come and go to keep my perspective.
Where did you live in the walled city? I know the Christian Quarter, but what, like, was it?
I lived very close to the Via Dolorosa. Just in there was a Christian family that had an apartment upstairs. It was great.
Oh, nice.
Go up in the morning, sit on a roof. I could see the whole city. It was really, really, really lovely, and they were lovely people, very friendly. And I found that the people in the city were generally very, very kind and welcoming.
That's very nice. Okay, so here's a question: what are the
city of David, and why it's so important is that it's this huge area that hasn't been disturbed in centuries. So it is giving archaeologists for the first time a really clear view of a large chunk of Jerusalem, because you can go down through the layers, from the Islamic layers into the Roman layers, down into I think they got down to about the time of the Babylonian destruction. There's this amazing building that they have. It's probably an administrative building from before the time of the Babylonian destruction that was probably a kind of government reception room for to have parties, because they found like little appetizer bowls, things like that. So it's giving people a really clear view of periods of Jerusalem that had been invisible. The Persian period, when we think a lot of the Bible was written, a lot of what Christians call the Old Testament was written, has been virtually invisible archaeologically. As the same is true for Hellenistic times. So the whole, the story of Hanukkah, of course, that takes place in Hellenistic times. but there's been no archaeological evidence. So it's really exciting to see that dig shedding light on these periods about which we've known next to nothing.
Okay. Thank you. And then let's see, can you summarize the best evidence that we have that there was a first temple dating back to the time of Solomon, or that Solomon was in Jerusalem?
Right. Great question. Now, I'm speaking about this from a scientific archaeological point of view. And there is no archaeological evidence for a Temple of Solomon or for a Solomon. We don't have any inscriptions. So outside of the Bible, we don't have any evidence for Solomon, certainly not in Jerusalem. And of course, the problem is that the Temple of Solomon, which, I think there's very few archaeologists who would doubt that it existed. But the question is, how do you get the evidence? And it sat on the Temple Mount, which is now part of the noble sanctuary. And Muslims, as in most religious people, do not want people coming to dig in their sacred place. I don't think that if Buddhists wanted to dig in St. Peter's, that the Catholics would be really thrilled with that. So the area is pretty much off limits for archaeology. So I think finding evidence for the Temple of Solomon is probably a pipe dream, in part because Herod probably destroyed the evidence. When he had the temple renovated, the second temple renovated, he probably cleared it out and leveled everything. So any evidence of that temple may well be gone. So again, this is not a question of was a temple there or not. It's just we don't have evidence for it, and maybe someday there will be. And just to mention, there's actually no physical evidence for the second temple even. There's evidence for the temple complex and inscriptions that talk about the Jewish temple complex in the 1st century BC, but we don't have anything from the temple itself. Again, that may have been wiped out by the Romans, so it could well be that there simply isn't anything to find, even if we could dig.
Okay, thank you. And how old is Jerusalem?
The oldest buildings that have been found are located in the city of David, that little peninsula of land, and you can see them today. There's in this little field with shrubs growing up, but they're the stone foundations of houses that were built sometime around 3000 BC. So this is the same time as the first cities in Egypt, Mesopotamia. So this is a really critical time called the early Bronze Age, when humans are first beginning to settle into large-scale settlements. So Jerusalem stretches back to the beginning.
That's very cool. Okay, here's a question. Despite some of the agendas, do you feel that most of the current digs are appropriately driven by and putting science at the forefront of how they are approaching their work and reporting their findings?
Wow, that's a great question. That goes to the heart of what I tried to explore, particularly toward the end of the book. And the thing is, I have a lot of empathy for these archaeologists, because so many of them that I met are really great scientists who are trying to focus on the science. And but they're working in a very difficult environment. They're working in an environment that is so politicized and so religiously charged that it's very, very difficult to just work as if that doesn't exist. I mean, you really see it when you're there, that you can't separate the archaeology from the religion and from the politics. And in part, just the fact that Palestinians are not allowed to dig in Jerusalem. There are no Palestinian archaeologists working inside Jerusalem. That's just not allowed by the Israeli Antiquity Authority, which controls the dig permits. So right there, you see that there's a way in which your point of view is going to be focused on one religious group, one ethnic group. So while I have empathy for the archaeologists, I think we also just have to consider that this is a place that has heritage stretching back a long way, that includes not just Jews, but Christians and Canaanites and Muslims. And that's what makes Jerusalem so wonderful, is that incredible historical diversity. And there are important questions about when you have somebody funding a dig who wants to find the city of David. They want to find evidence for King David and King Solomon. how does that influence archaeologists? And that's a difficult and a difficult question to answer.
Yeah, it's a tough one. And what I wonder is if there's a way to do a cooperative dig. I know that doesn't
Well,
really
I actually tried. I walked in and I was trying to see if there was some way that National Geographic could help fund something like that. But the trouble is that no Palestinian archaeologist would want to be involved because they would be blacklisted by their community, and Jewish archaeologists would be very unlikely to want to take part in it because there'd be blowback on their side as well from the right. So, and not to mention, it just politically, would be extremely difficult to do. Remember, it's Jerusalem. This argument over who owns what's under Jerusalem that largely destroyed the peace talks in around the year 1000, 2000.
The world's most contested city.
Yeah.
As you say. So here's a question. Do any of the teams at least include Israeli Arabs?
Not in Jerusalem. There are, I met several Israeli Arab archaeologists who work outside of Jerusalem, but inside Jerusalem, and I can't say exactly why, but I didn't meet any. It's, I think, an area that is just too fraught for Israeli Arabs to really want to get involved with, because it is so tied up with the politics and religion and the conflict between the Palestinians and the Israeli Jews.
Okay, it makes sense. It fits everything we know.
And I should add that there are very few foreign archaeologists working there. I mean, there's one or two Americans, but not many. Americans and Europeans generally are not welcomed by the Israeli Antiquities Authority. I mean, the Israeli Antiquities Authority has a staff. They like to keep it kind of in-house. So you don't have many foreign digs there, which as a result has made Jerusalem archaeology a little old-fashioned, because it hasn't been as tied into the new developments and the collegial back and forth that happens among archaeologists in different countries. And that has made Jerusalem's archaeology, has kept it focused on, I think, kind of old-fashioned ideas and techniques. And that's fortunately beginning to change these days.
Andrew, when American Jews go to Israel, it's not uncommon for them to be part of archaeological digs. I put that in quotation marks because my question is, what are they like? Are they really doing? Are they really part of these digs? Are they looking for something that hasn't been found? Are they real digs? What's really happening there?
Oh yes, archaeology is very labor intensive. I mean, it's really hard work. I like writing about it. I wouldn't want to do it. Oh my God, it's hard. You really are out there in the sun and the dirt, and you've got to be very careful, but you've also got to move a lot of dirt, and you got to know what you're doing. And but because labor is so difficult to get, then archaeologists are happy to have students or retirees, come and spend a season, and they're even happier to take your money, because archaeologists generally everywhere in the world aren't very well funded. I mean, we're not talking about medical research here, so they're really chronically underfunded. So they need volunteers and people who are willing to pay to do it. And it's a fantastic experience to do it. What I would add to the mix is that I think it's also important to remember that there are agendas behind those people funding these digs in bringing in outsiders, because you'll be fed a certain perspective. I'm not saying that's a wrong perspective, but I think it's good to lift your head up and look around and maybe ask questions and see beyond just kind of the cool nature of the dig. Because in Jerusalem, if you focus just in what's in front of you, you're going to miss that bigger picture.
And that's why it's hard to do a cooperative dig.
Yeah.
All right. Well, if there are any more questions, I'm happy to share them with Andrew. And second to that, I want to just thank you. This has been absolutely fascinating. And when I finish this book, I look forward to looking at your others. And you write really, really well. And
Well,
that's
thank you. And
that's
and
huge.
I want to shout out to your local bookstore. If people
Bookworm.
are interested in getting the book, then I'm a big supporter of local independent bookstores because they're the ones that really are keeping communities alive and vibrant and literate. And so just want to let your congregation know, and I'm sure they probably know the bookstore, but do support them.
It's called Bookworm. It's in Bernardsville, and you're even sending autographed book plates, right?
I can, yeah, I'd be happy to do that. Yeah.
Okay. That's
So
great.
if you want an autograph in the book, I sign a sticker, they put it in the book. And so if you want it signed to somebody or what have you, then that is possible.
That's very nice. Thank you. One more question. Is there a book you can recommend about the Muslim history of Jerusalem?
Oh, wow. That's a great question. Let's see, on my bookshelf here, let's see what I can find. I'll have to get back to you on that because there really are not many that I know of. But there is one about the Temple Mount, about the Noble Sanctuary. That's a great combination of Jewish scholars as well as Arab scholars that talks about, it's called Where Heaven Meets Earth. So if you can find that, it's a beautiful book. It's a large book by Oleg Grabar is one of the editors. And it's got a really nice collection of it's almost interfaith, and it's very unusual, Where Heaven Meets Earth. Let me be sure that that's the title. I believe, I can't find it right now, but I believe that's it. So I would recommend that if you can find it.
That's great. We'll track it down. That's wonderful.
Great.
Thank you.
Andrew, Rabbi, can I say something?
Sure.
For those that don't know me, I had the pleasure of doing the legal review because some of the people involved in these digs are still alive and invested in their reputations. And I just want to say, if you found any of this interesting, a piece of this, there's just so much more in the book, and it's a really fascinating book. And I had the pleasure of working on Andrew's first book, which is about the lost colony of Roanoke, which is not a thing I thought about a lot prior to reading his book. And it was really fascinating. It has all these resonances to today that you just don't expect. So I really highly recommend it. And then, read the book, and then I'll debate you about what I think it means. Thank you so much, Andrew, for coming.
Thank you, Dan.
All right, this is great. Thank you very much. And we'll stay in touch because we want to know what you're going to do next. Do you have any ideas what you're going to do next?
I
What are
do.
you working on now?
I do, but I'm not going to tell you. I'll just say that it's something a little more, it has to do with more American history, because getting on a plane going overseas may not be easy for the next year or so. So
yeah,
I may be closer to home.
All right. Well, we look forward to it.
Great. All right. Well,
Dan will keep us informed.
Good. He will.
All right. Be well. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks again.
Our pleasure. Truly.